Hi, welcome back to the lecture on the classical age of Greece. In the last lecture, we discussed kind of the political evolution of the Greeks, and in this lecture, we're going to focus primarily on kind of what I call the ascendancy of Greece and the kind of ultimate downfall of the Greek civilization in terms of its military dominance. If you remember back to our lecture on Persia, the story of the Persians and the Greeks is linked. And kind of the story of one, the defeat of one, is kind of the rise of the other. Starting in 499 and lasting for a period of about 20 years, we have a so-called series of wars referred to as the Persian Wars. And the Persian Wars kind of signified the connection and kind of this relationship between the Greeks and the Persians. In the year 499, the Persian Empire was pretty much at its height, and it was basically very stable and running quite well. The event that's going to kind of change all that is a revolt referred to as the Ionian Revolt. And if I move this dialog box, basically, if you remember, Ionia was located here, and the city of Miletus located here, which was kind of the semi-capital of this Ionian area. And in the year 499, the Ionian Greeks basically revolted against the Persian Empire, if the map extended, which would basically extend all the way to modern-day Iran. And the Ionian Revolt started in 499. Initially, the Persians kind of ignored it, but as problems continued to arise and the revolution became stronger, Darius of Persia eventually sent troops to kind of quell the events, which culminated as a show of force in the destruction of the city of Miletus. Now, in response to that, the Ionian Greeks appealed to the mainland Greeks located here for help, and they basically asked the Greeks that were living in traditional Greece to send supplies, soldiers, and aid. As a result of the destruction of Miletus, which was kind of a cultural center of the Greek world, the Greeks did respond. They did help the Ionians keep the revolution going for another 6 years, to the point that Darius basically decided to bypass Ionia and to invade Greece. So he would basically take his soldiers, march up, and back down. This is the first invasion of Greece by the Persians. Unfortunately for the Persians, after a 2-year conflict, the Persian forces were defeated eventually at the so-called Battle of Marathon. And the war kind of died down for almost a decade, with the Greeks enjoying a relative time period of basically peace. However, Xerxes, successor of Darius, decided to reinstitute and retake control of Ionia and to renew the hostilities with the Greek mainland. He invaded again in 480, and once again, due to the presence of superior Greek military tactics, that hoplite soldier, as well as a military formation that we didn't mention, called the phalanx, which was basically an 8x8 group of soldiers that fought in tandem. They fought together, and they lived and died together. That was the kind of the basis of that idea of that social transformation. The phalanx forced Greeks to rely on each other. And in order to build that sense of reliance, they had to formulate this idea of citizenship that we talked about in the last lecture. So, getting back to the Persian Wars, contrary to Xerxes' belief that the Persians would be victorious, we have the so-called Battle of Thermopylae, in which prior to that we have the Battle of the 298 or the Battle of 300, upon which the movie 300 is based. The Persian forces were basically thoroughly defeated again in 479, and eventually the Persians had to withdraw from Greece completely. And this show of weakness then started a spark that would eventually basically force the collapse of the Persian Empire approximately by about the end of the 4th century BCE. Now, so the Persian Wars are positive wars for Greece, negative wars for Persia, and the Greeks basically took this put them on a world stage and enabled them to kind of assume a position as a kind of world culture or world power. Now, during the time period after the end of the Persian Wars, from 477 to the 460s, basically about 17 years, the Greeks again lived in relative peace, but there were problems brewing. The so-called creation of the Delian League in 477, which was a mutual defense league against the Persians, kind of got the ball rolling. The Spartans, unfortunately, even though they had been highly important and significant in terms of the Persian Wars, suffered a series of slave revolts that forced them to remove themselves from Greek politics. And in the face of having no Spartan counterbalance, the Delian League would soon be taken over by Athens, and then it became kind of a coercive league that Athens used to kind of fund the growth of Athens, as opposed to funding the stability of Greece. They used the money to particularly fund the growth of Athens and to achieve more power. And as you see on these slides there, by the year 470, Athens had actually coerced and forced Greek city-states to stay in the league and to continue making payments to Athens for their, quote, protection. Now, after the 470s, Sparta began to emerge as a Greek power again, and right away the Athenian pure democracy voted to kind of target Sparta and to create what we call an anti-Spartan policy. And then basically from the year 470 until the year 460, both Sparta and Athens tried to create rival leagues, if you will, to kind of decide the fate of Greece. Fighting broke out first in 460, and the First Peloponnesian War lasted from 460 to 446, with the Spartans and Athens basically going to war, but not really being able to defeat each other because Sparta was a land-based military structure and Athens was a water-based military structure. And so basically, from 460 to 446, for 14 years, the Peloponnesian War just kind of ground out and cost lots of lives and lots of resources, but did not achieve any real end. Excuse me. From 446 until 431, the war was then placed on hold, and things kind of died down for about a decade. However, the Second Peloponnesian War started back up in 431 and would be fought off and on for the next 27 years. We have periods of peace between Athens and Sparta, known as the Peace of Nicias, which was from 421 to 418, again in 414. But ultimately, the two sides were constantly at war, basically dragging all of the Greek city-states into this Greek-wide war. Not to be outdone, and realizing that something had to be done that was different, the Spartans tried to get a new Greek city-state to join in, and that city-state was the city-state of Syracuse. Now, in case you don't know, Syracuse was a Greek colony that was actually based on the island of Sicily. And as a result of being an island-based Greek city-state, it was predominantly a maritime or a water-based military force. And the idea of the Spartans was that if they could get Syracuse to join with them, they could then have both a land and water-based attack upon Athens that could end the war. Now, ironically, Athens knew about Sparta's attempt to talk to Syracuse, and the pure democracy had a choice. It could either vote to approach Syracuse and try to make Syracuse an ally. It could vote to do nothing, which wouldn't be a good plan. Or it could vote to basically attack Syracuse and knock Syracuse out of the war before they ever got in. And ironically, that pure democracy ultimately decided to attack Syracuse. And in doing so, they opened themselves up to a two-front war. And the other bad choice they made was they decided to attack Syracuse in Syracuse, which means that they were now fighting a naval battle in a brand new stretch of the Mediterranean Sea that they were unfamiliar with. and of course their enemy, being the Syracusans, was intimately familiar with, because that was their home field, if you will. And so, long story short, the war between Athens and Syracuse lasted from 415 to 413, and it eventually resulted in the defeat of the Athenian navy. From that point forward, in 413 to 404, Syracuse joined with Sparta and the other city-states of the Peloponnesian League, and they ultimately defeated the Delian League, and they defeated Athens, and took control of the city of Athens in 404. They abolished its pure democracy, and ultimately then set what we call a puppet government up to run Athens from about 404 to about the 390s. And this will, of course, become very important later on when we discuss Greek philosophy. Now, from 404 to 371, the Spartans were in charge, and they basically took control of the Greek political world for about, about 33 years. However, through this stretching of Spartan resources and Spartan attention, eventually, with the aid of the city-state of Thebes, the Helots revolted in Sparta and destroyed Spartan stability, eliminating Sparta as a major Greek player. Then the city-state of Thebes took over and tried to kind of take control of the Greek political world. They managed to control Greece from about 371 to 338. All the while, there was a lot of internal warfare, a lot of internal rebellions and problems for Thebes. Now, the long and the short of all of this is that from 470, after the end of the Persian Wars, basically the Greeks engaged in an almost non-stop, it was intermittent, but a consistent war internally, in which all they really did was weaken themselves and kind of destroy their resources. And that ultimately led to the rise of a rival Greek state. It was not included in classical Greek. They were Greek speakers, they shared Greek culture, but they were not accepted by the Greeks as being Greek. And this group of people were known as the Macedonians. And if we go back to that map on the previous slide, Macedon was located right here. And so all of this internal fighting and weakness that was bred by these internal wars allowed the Greeks under Macedon, under Philip II, king of Macedon, it allowed the Macedonians to invade Greece in 338 and to basically conquer all of Greece and merge it into one giant Macedonian empire by the year of 336. And so if we bring up that old idea of the Greek flaw being excessive pride, by the time we reach the end of the Golden Age, in reality the Greek flaw was in fact an inability to avoid internal civil war, which ultimately weakened all of the main classical Greek city-states and led to the rise of Philip II. Now, that basically takes us to a change in Greek history period that we call the Hellenistic period of Greece. It's not a change in culture. It's not a change in terms of what was going on culturally, economically, socially. But the reason why we use that term is to represent the inclusion of the Hellenes, the Macedonians, into this new Greek world. And just to give you a bit of trivia, the word Hellas in Greek means Greek. And so when we talk about Hellenistic Greek, we're now referring to Greece as a cultural area as opposed to being strictly a political area. Now, the Hellenistic civilization was a time period of dramatic expansion and growth for Greek culture and the Greek way of life. Philip II, who'd kind of orchestrated the conquest of Greece, unfortunately was assassinated by his ex-wife in 336. And when he was assassinated, his only son was Alexander the Great, who had been tutored, if you remember, by Aristotle. Alexander the Great was a great thinker when it came to military strategy and also to organization, probably things he picked up from Aristotle. In order to kind of secure his succession, however, he did have to distance himself from his birth mother. His father, Philip II, had actually just got remarried in 336, and so the reason why his ex-wife poisoned him was to prevent the birth of a rival son that could replace Alexander the Great. But Alexander realized that if he didn't do something, he would be accused of participating in the assassination. And so he basically had his mother and her lover arrested and executed as traitors of the Greek Empire. Once he'd kind of secured that succession, Alexander the Great actually went on to expand the Greek world to a size that had before this time been completely unrealized. If you take a look at this map, you can see what Alexander the Great inherited was basically Greece and Macedonia. And over the course of 13 years, Alexander the Great conquered all of the Middle East. He conquered Egypt. He basically killed off the old Persian Empire and got as far as the Indus River in India. Excuse me. He did all of this in 13 years using the superior Greek military strategies of the phalanx, coupled with an extremely sound expansion strategy and an organizational skill that up until this point probably hadn't been seen in that great a detail. Unfortunately for Alexander the Great, when he reached the Indus River, his troops had eventually tired of war, and they refused to cross the Indus River and to conquer India. On his way back from the battlefield, we believe Alexander the Great contracted some kind of flu or some kind of disease, and that he ultimately did not even return back to Greece, but died in the city of Babylon. And when he died in the city of Babylon, he left his massive empire to a son who was underage and who could not basically assume control. And that led to a failure of his empire, which resulted in the split of the empire into three separate groups called the Antigonid Empire, which was basically Greece and Asia Minor, the Ptolemaic Empire, which was Egypt and part of Palestine, and the Seleucid Empire, which was the largest but also the shortest lived empire, which would basically be all of the Middle East, all of Asia, all of the areas between basically India and Turkey. Just to kind of key up later things we'll talk about, the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt would rule Egypt from the 320s all the way up until their last Ptolemy ruled Egypt, who would be Cleopatra. She was the ruler of Egypt in the year 27, and she was basically the sixth generation of that Greek general known as Ptolemy. She was husband and sister to Ptolemy the sixth. So Egypt was the longest lasting of these empires. It lasted more than almost 300 years. The shortest was the Seleucid Empire, and pretty much within about 100 years, the Greek Empire, known as the Antigonid Empire, basically broke down into, again, Greek leagues and basically a unified cultural empire without a single overarching government structure. Now, if we take a look at the true greatness of Alexander the Great, it's not necessarily in the size of his empire, but rather it's in the spreading of Greek culture. You see, under Alexander the Great and his conquest of all that territory, he basically, over the course of centuries, was able to force a cultural shift in the ancient world. This cultural shift was a shift towards what we call urban culture. The Greeks were predominantly urban. They based their culture upon cities. And Alexander the Great himself built more than a dozen cities in all the conquered areas that he controlled. Now, he did have a huge ego, and most of those cities were actually referred to or named Alexandre something. For example, Alexandria in Egypt, Alexandretta in Asia Minor, all of those areas today that had formal names of like Alexander something were built during Alexander the Great's expansion. And what he really did was he basically spread Greek culture, Greek language, and especially Greek science and technology throughout the ancient world. And he unified the ancient world in an unbefore-seen way. So that now, if one wanted to be educated, one had to be educated in terms of Greek philosophy and Greek culture, as well as giving rise to brand new philosophies and religions that were basically spreading all across Alexander the Great's former empire. Just to kind of talk about some of these, Stoicism was a belief that one had to base your happiness upon internal feeling as opposed to external stimulus, which means that if you won the lottery, you shouldn't be happy because that's an external thing that you can't control. And if you lost everything, that was external again, and you shouldn't be sad. Skepticism was a philosophy in which the people that followed skepticism doubted everything. They basically had to be convinced, or they were constantly skeptical of ideas and thoughts and different things. Just to give you an idea, if you happen to be from the state of Missouri or know the state of Missouri, Missouri is called the state of the skeptics because the motto of our state is the show me state. And that's kind of what skepticism is. It's the belief that you won't accept anything unless somebody proves it to you. Now, the last great thing I want to talk about, which it wasn't very popular at the time, but has become extremely popular in the modern world, is the Greek philosophy known as Cynicism. Or it's also been known in terms of modern terms under the ideas of relativism or postmodern deconstructionism. And what that refers to, very simply, is that cynics believed that there were, in fact, no absolute principles, truths, or etc. That everything was related or relative to the particular circumstance. And so what that would mean is that the cynics denied that there was truth. They said, in fact, that there could be thousands of different forms of truth depending on the circumstances. And so what might be true for you would not be true for someone else because they would have different circumstances. And so the idea of the skeptics was that they might doubt the existence of truth. Cynics, on the other hand, denied the existence of truth. They said that there was, in fact, no real truth with a capital T, but rather there was resultant truths from different circumstances. And the circumstances would determine if something was true or if it wasn't. And this cynicism actually became a direct kind of competitor to the ideas of the Socratics that believed in absolute truth and absolute knowledge and all that. It went dormant for a while, but would come back with a strong following in the modern era in what we call relativism, to where now, if sometimes you ask people, if something is right or wrong, they'll say it depends on the circumstances. That is a cynic response or a relativist response. Well, I hope that that's kind of summed things up in terms of Greek history. It's extremely detailed and complex. I've done my best to kind of break it down for you in 2 lectures of about 20 minutes. One could spend weeks, if not months and years, talking all about Greek history and the nature of Greek history and its impacts. You definitely would want to make use of your online resources to help kind of fill out any information you might need. Definitely, if you have any questions, send me an email or let me know if you have some questions. At this point, we'll go ahead and close our lecture on classical Greece. And that sets up our final kind of topic that we'll talk about, which is a little bit about Greek philosophy and Greek thought. Thank you again for listening to these lectures. I look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you.